Welcome back. When we left the early civilizations of the ancient Near East, we had confronted the irony of small, short-lived Hebrew kingdoms casting a much longer historical shadow than mighty empires. The collected stories of the Hebrews endured, while monumental imperial inscriptions became incomprehensible. This week we will consider the equally remarkable story of the Greeks, a quarrelsome people living in small city-states who not only managed to survive, but spread their language, ideas, and ways of life throughout the Mediterranean Sea, the Near East, and even into South Asia. Even more impressive than the extent of Greek influence has been its durability. Greek became a common language of many cities along the Mediterranean and in the Near East from the late 4th century BCE until the 7th century of the Common Era, roughly for 1,000 years. Moreover, as we shall see, the ideas of the Greeks about politics, art, and science endured much longer. For example, the struggle between Athens and Sparta during 3 decades during the 5th century BCE filled newspaper columns during the founding of the American Republic, and continues to fill library shelves to this day. How did this happen? In this video, we will consider some of the basic characteristics of Greek life and culture that contributed to the development of the seemingly irreconcilable constitutions of Athens and Sparta that continue to fascinate us. As we have done previously, it often helps to start with a mental map of the whole story. Imagine the history of ancient Greek civilization divided into 5 periods. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. The first era was the so-called Dark Age, between 1200 and 700 BCE. Remember the collapse of the Bronze Age kingdoms? The phone went dead in Greece as well. Writing in the first Greek script, Linear B, ceased and was not deciphered again until the 20th century of the Common Era. People literally headed for the hills. The second period is described as the Archaic period. In Greek, the expression in arche means in the beginning. It began around 700 BCE and is usually considered to have ended in 480 BCE. During this time, the basic forms of Greek life developed: the polis, colonies, and Panhellenism. The third age is the so-called Classical period, from 480 BCE until 323 BCE. Note the exact date. It's a battle. During this century and a half, Greek civilization made miraculous cultural and political developments as it confronted its nemesis, the mighty Persian Empire. The fourth period is the so-called Hellenistic Age. During this time, Greek ideas and ways of life were spread far and wide by the conquests of Alexander the Great and his successors. Somewhat surprisingly, they stuck for centuries. The Hellenistic Age is usually considered as having lasted from 323 BCE until 31 BCE. Finally, I know you are tired. During the fifth period, the Hellenistic world came under the control of the Romans. That is another week. But in the Roman East, Greek ways and language endured until 1453 CE. Now on to Sparta and Athens. In order to understand the constitutions of Athens and Sparta, we need to consider what made the Greeks tick. Greeks became Greeks by competing with other Greeks. Practically every aspect of life was made into a contest. The word for a struggle was agon. Yes, it is the source of our word agony as well as protagonist and antagonist. Along with the usual arenas of politics and war, Greeks even arranged religion around competitions. Panhellenic games at sacred places such as Olympias or Delphi, yes, the source of the Olympic Games. Similarly, the classic plays of Aeschylus and Euripides were produced for competitions that were the focus of a religious festival, not simply a night out in the town. Even philosophy was written in the form of a verbal struggle between men. The Greeks understood that competition was a two-edged sword. Hesiod, a poet almost as ancient as Homer, Observe that on the one hand, competition encouraged men to try and outdo one another in good works. This benefits mankind. It was also useful in war. On the other hand, competition can also arouse resentment, violence, and slaughter between citizens. The Greeks referred to the violence within a community as stasis. During the archaic period, stasis was common. Aristocrats emulating the heroic ideals of Homer disturbed communities with their unrestrained competition for honor and power. First tyrants, and then the constitutions established by such legendary lawgivers as Lycurgus in Sparta and Solon in Athens, were intended to end stasis. They accomplished this not by ending competition, that would have been inconceivable and probably impious, but by creating what were essentially safe playpens for communities of competing male citizens. For example, in Sparta, the problem of maintaining peace among the mighty and providing security against hostile neighbors was solved by making war the full-time job of every male citizen. Let's take a look at a diagram. I would say a simple diagram, but that would be an exaggeration, of the Constitution of Sparta. A large circle in the shape of a hoplon, or Greek shield, represents the constitution and citizenry of Sparta, otherwise known as the Spartiates. Immediately you will notice that a great deal of the population of Laconia, that is the region where Sparta is located, are not included in the government of Sparta. The Spartiates made up only 5% of the population of Laconia. The largest group outside were helots, the state-controlled slaves. There were also perioikoi, that is, tradesmen and artisans who were free but paid the Spartiate tribute. All adult Spartiates, those who had successfully completed the agoge you read about, were members of an assembly called the Apella. The Apella elected by acclamation, meaning literally which side yelled the loudest, two councils, the Gerousia and the Ephors. The Gerousia, literally the old ones, was made up of 28 men over the age of 60, a rare feat in Sparta, who served for life. This was the highest honor a Spartan could aspire to. The Gerousia controlled justice and set the agenda for the Apella. That assembly could only yell yea or nay. There was no debate. The Gerousia deliberated with the two kings of Sparta. The Spartans explained this anomaly as a product of twin heirs of Hercules. These kings were responsible for the army and religion. They were not like the powerful kings and emperors we saw in the ancient Near East. Their relative weakness is illustrated by their relationship with the final council, the Ephors. The 5 Ephors were elected annually by acclamation and could only serve one term. Their job was to ensure fair play. They even had the right to supervise both the Gerousia and the kings, even to depose kings or members of the Gerousia if they broke the laws and customs of Sparta. Yes, I know, this seems like a complicated system. It was meant to be. The idea was to make sure that there was a balance of power. There were limits to competition. The Spartans were obsessed with what they called eunomia, literally good rules or laws, but probably better translated as good order. We think of the Athenian constitution as being completely different from Sparta, but it was also intended to establish eunomia and prevent stasis. Without going into as much detail, you ought to have watched the assigned video segment on Athens. Let's see how similar principles were involved. The Athenians used collegiality, rotation, and annual elections in order to make sure that no person or faction would come to dominate government. Collegiality simply means that though you might be the leading archon for that year, there were 8 other archons that you had to cooperate with. Rotation meant that offices such as juror were filled by lot, that is, randomly. As you saw in the video, they even had a randomizing machine. Annual elections combined with a one-term limit meant that practically every citizen could be assured of participating in government at various levels. The philosopher Aristotle summed it up thus: when all are equal, the only just situation is to rule and be ruled in turn. As you can see, the constitutions of the polis in the Greek world, though varied, usually had the aim of preventing stasis. As a result, although the democracy of Athens might appear like our own in some ways, there was no conception of individual rights. Women, foreigners, and slaves were excluded, but rather the goal was the common good. Likewise, the constitution of Sparta, while outlandish to us, made sense to Greeks. According to the writer Xenophon, Sparta was everywhere admired and nowhere imitated.